If you've ever waited for someone who didn't come, or believed silence meant you were forgotten, this story will feel very real to you. Across the United States, millions of seniors experience loneliness in old age, not because they are unloved, but because life quietly pulls families apart. This story reveals how it happens and how it can be healed. Every evening at exactly 6 o'clock, Margaret Lewis pulled her chair closer to the front window. She was 78 years old and had lived in the same modest home in Indiana for over 50 years. The neighborhood had changed, the trees had grown taller, and most of the familiar faces were gone, but Margaret's routine never changed. She waited. From her chair, she could see the sidewalk clearly. Children used to ride their bicycles there once. Now it was mostly empty. Sometimes a neighbor passed by. Sometimes a delivery truck slowed down. Every time headlights appeared, her heart lifted, just a little. Margaret told herself she was only watching the sunset, but the truth was deeper. She was waiting for her daughter. This is a common reality in senior life today. Aging parents often structure their days around small hopes, a visit, a call, a familiar voice. They don't always say it out loud, but the waiting becomes part of survival. Margaret's daughter, Susan, lived just 40 minutes away, not across the country, not overseas, just far enough for visits to become next week instead of today. At first, Susan came often. After her husband passed away, those visits were Margaret's anchor. They shared dinner, talked about memories, and laughed at old family stories. Over time, life grew busy. Work demands increased. Grandchildren needed attention. The visits slowly shortened, then disappeared. Margaret never complained. That's another social issue many seniors face: emotional self-silencing. Older adults often believe expressing loneliness will make them a burden, so they smile. They say, "I'm fine," and they wait quietly. That evening, Margaret folded her hands in her lap and looked at the clock. 6:15. She remembered something Susan once said. "Mom, you don't need me hovering over you." Susan meant well. She was encouraging independence. But independence, when misunderstood, can turn into emotional distance. Margaret didn't need hovering. She needed remembering. She glanced at the phone on the side table. She thought about calling, just to hear her daughter's voice, but the same thought stopped her every time. "She's busy. I don't want to interrupt. I'll wait." Waiting is a dangerous habit when combined with love. As the sky turned orange and the streetlights flickered on, Margaret leaned back in her chair, holding on to a hope she never spoke out loud: that tonight, someone might finally come. What if the reason someone stops calling is not because they don't care, but because they're afraid they matter too much? This part reveals a painful truth many U.S. seniors live with, often without saying a word. Margaret used to be the one who called first. When Susan was younger, Margaret never hesitated. She called to check in, to offer advice, to ask simple questions like whether Susan had eaten or slept well. Back then, it felt natural, necessary. But as the years passed, something subtle changed. Susan's responses grew shorter. Calls became rushed, sometimes unanswered, not out of cruelty, but out of a life moving too fast. Margaret noticed the sighs on the other end of the line, the distracted tone, the familiar phrase, "Mom, I'll call you back." Often, that call never came. This is a common social pattern in modern families. Adult children juggle careers, responsibilities, and constant pressure. Seniors, sensing that pressure, begin to withdraw.
not because they want to, but because they don't want to add to it. Margaret began to tell herself a new story. She doesn't need me anymore. That belief didn't arrive suddenly. It grew slowly, nourished by missed calls and postponed visits. Over time, Margaret's confidence in her daughter's life quietly eroded. This is one of the least discussed issues among aging parents, the fear of becoming irrelevant. Margaret remembered the day she decided to stop calling first. Susan sounded tired, not angry, just worn down. When the call ended, Margaret sat in her chair for a long time, holding the phone, wondering whether love could feel so heavy to the person receiving it. So she made a choice. She would wait instead. Waiting felt respectful. Waiting felt mature. Waiting felt like love that knew its limits. But waiting also felt lonely. That loneliness didn't show itself dramatically. It showed up in small ways. Longer evenings, quieter meals, conversations held only in her mind. Margaret began speaking less, even when neighbors visited. She didn't want to explain a sadness she couldn't justify. Loneliness among seniors often hides behind routine. The world sees stability, while the heart experiences absence. That night, as Margaret watched the empty sidewalk, a realization settled in her chest. Silence had become normal. And when silence becomes normal, it stops being questioned. She reached for the phone again, then stopped. Not tonight, she thought. She didn't know that each night of waiting was slowly teaching her something dangerous, that her voice no longer deserved space.
There comes a moment when waiting no longer feels patient. It feels empty. If you've ever realized something precious was fading, not suddenly, but quietly, this part will speak to you. That evening, Margaret did not move her chair closer to the window. She stayed in the kitchen instead, staring at the clock as it crept past 6. The habit felt heavier than usual, like a weight she could no longer lift. She told herself she was tired, that she didn't need to look outside tonight. But she did. She always did. When she finally sat down, the street looked the same as always, quiet, familiar, unchanged. And yet, something felt different. The hope wasn't there. Margaret realized she wasn't expecting her daughter anymore. Not truly. The waiting had turned into a ritual without belief, like a prayer spoken without faith. This moment marks a painful emotional shift many seniors experience, when hope slowly gives way to acceptance, not healthy acceptance, but resignation. She stood up and turned off the lamp by the window. The glass reflected her face faintly. Older, softer, carrying years of unspoken words. In that reflection, she saw something she hadn't noticed before. She had been disappearing. Not physically, emotionally. Margaret walked down the hallway and paused at an old family photograph. Susan was smiling in it, younger, her arm wrapped tightly around her mother's shoulders. They had been inseparable once. She touched the frame gently, as if the memory could feel her. That's when the phone rang. The sound startled her. Her heart jumped, then sank, hope and fear colliding at once. She picked it up slowly, bracing herself. It wasn't Susan. It was her neighbor calling to say she'd seen Susan's car parked outside Margaret's house earlier that afternoon. Margaret frowned. That couldn't be right. No one had come. No knock, no doorbell. The realization hit her quietly, but deeply. Susan had stopped by and left. Perhaps she saw the lights off. Perhaps she thought Margaret was resting. Or perhaps she assumed another day would be better. This is the tragedy of assumption.
We believe silence means absence when it often means uncertainty. Margaret sat down heavily. The truth settled in her chest. Her daughter hadn't known whether she was welcome, and Margaret hadn't known how to say she was. That night, Margaret cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to feel the weight of everything she hadn't said. The next part reveals what Margaret finally chooses to do.
Sometimes the hardest words to say are the simplest ones, and sometimes one small message can carry the weight of a lifetime. Margaret didn't sleep much that night. She lay in bed listening to the quiet hum of the house, the same house that once echoed with laughter, slammed doors, hurried footsteps. Now, even the walls felt like they were holding their breath. Just before dawn, she sat up. There was a feeling she couldn't ignore anymore. Not urgency, not panic. Something steadier, something braver. Resolve. She reached for her phone. The screen glowed too bright in the dark room, making her squint. Her fingers hovered over Susan's name. She hadn't typed a message to her daughter in years. Calls, yes, polite check-ins, short conversations filled with safe words. But this felt different. She started typing, then stopped, deleted it, typed again, deleted it again. What do you say when you've been quiet for too long? How do you explain years of silence without sounding like blame? Her hands trembled slightly as she finally wrote, "I was home yesterday." She stared at the words. They felt heavy, accusatory. She erased them. Then she tried again. "I sit by the window most evenings." Erase. Her chest tightened. Tears blurred the screen. She wasn't trying to guilt her daughter. She just wanted to be seen. After a long pause, she typed the truth, the kind that doesn't defend itself. "I miss you. I'm always happy when you come by, even if I don't say it well." She read it 3 times. Her thumb hovered over the send button. This was the moment many people never reach, the moment where pride loosens its grip and vulnerability steps forward. It's terrifying, because once words are sent, they can't be taken back. Margaret closed her eyes and pressed send. The phone felt heavier in her hand afterward, as if it now carried something fragile. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. She placed the phone face down on the table, unable to watch. When it finally buzzed, she jumped. Susan's reply was short, only 1 sentence. "I didn't know." Margaret covered her mouth. That single line said everything. Not anger, not excuses, just realization. A few moments later, another message came through. "I thought you needed space. I didn't want to bother you." Margaret let out a soft, broken laugh, the kind that comes from understanding arriving too late, but still arriving. 2 people, both waiting, both silent, both afraid of being a burden. That afternoon, Margaret turned on the lamp by the window earlier than usual. She placed 2 cups on the kitchen table, just in case. Some reunions don't need speeches. They only need the door to open. If you've ever wished for one more honest moment with someone you love, this ending is for you. Margaret heard the knock just after 6. Not loud, not rushed, careful. For a moment, she didn't move. Old habits whispered that it might be someone else, that she shouldn't expect too much. But then she stood, smoothing her sweater with trembling hands. When she opened the door, Susan was standing there. No phone, no distractions, just her daughter, tired, uncertain, and very much present.
They looked at each other in silence. Years of misunderstanding stood between them, fragile as glass. Susan spoke first. "I should have stayed," she said softly. "That day, I thought you were resting. I didn't want to disturb you." Margaret nodded. Her voice came slowly, steady, but honest. "I was always waiting." Those 4 words carried everything. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where homework was once done and birthday cakes were cut. They talked, not to explain away the past, but to understand it. Susan admitted she thought giving space was kindness. Margaret admitted staying silent was love. Both had been wrong in the same way. This is a lesson many families learn too late. Love needs clarity, not assumption. They made simple promises, not perfect ones, real ones. Susan would visit without waiting for an invitation. Margaret would speak when she felt lonely, without apologizing for it. As the evening ended, Susan hugged her mother tightly. "I don't want you to wait anymore," she whispered. Margaret smiled through tears. "I won't," she said. From that night on, the chair by the window remained, but it no longer carried expectation. It became a place to watch sunsets, not count disappointments. The true moral of this story is simple but powerful. Loneliness grows in silence. Healing begins with honesty, and love, when spoken, always finds its way home. Loneliness among seniors is often invisible. Silence is often mistaken for strength. Clear communication prevents emotional distance. Small acts, visits, calls, messages, matter deeply. If this story felt familiar, don't wait by the window. Open the door. Make the call.